Good morning, Year 7. I hope you're all well and you had a wonderful, restful weekend. So, let's launch into today's poem because I want you to get lots of notes about it because this is a sort of really important shift in the way that we've looked at Kipling before. We're going to say in the next few days, building up to an essay next week, that his poetry after the war seems to be a bit more reflective. It doesn't seem to be quite as patriotic and pumped up as some of the poems we looked at before, the ones which many people identified as potentially racist, many of the poems that seemed extremely enthusiastic about the country and potentially about war, although there are some that say he never really talks openly about enjoying war. Nevertheless, he is certainly patriotic beforehand, and maybe there's a little dimming of that now. Okay, so for today's poem, it's called My Boy Jack, which, if you've watched the film, which you all have, you'll think, right, so this is a poem about his son, Jack Kipling. Well, actually, his son is called John Kipling. This is his son. So he's called John Kipling, and the poem is not directly about John Kipling, but clearly the subtext, i.e. the meaning beneath the poem, is about his the process of dealing with the grief of losing his son, John. In fact, the poem is it's a memorial for someone who died during the First World War in a sea battle. They were 16 years old and were awarded the highest possible military honour for serving in the war. They were awarded this military honour because they didn't leave their post during the Battle of Jutland, which was a really big sea battle. So extremely terrifying ordeal. Didn't leave their post once, and they were given a medal for their courage. So that's who the poem is about. But clearly, it's also about his son John, who died during the war. Okay, so as you go through the poem, I'm going to read each stanza, and then I will reflect on each stanza so that you can make some extra notes. I've given you the first few notes in each stanza to get you going, and then after that it's up to you. So please feel free to pause the video as much as you want. Feel free to pause the video after each stanza perhaps, and then afterwards, with all these notes, you'll have lots of good ideas about the poem that you can use to write. You can use that to write some answers to some questions. So, have you news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. When do you think that he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Okay, so in this first stanza then, the references to tides and the sea, they're because the poem is about a 16-year-old who died in a sea battle after not abandoning his post. But why are we talking about things like the wind and the tide? Well, the wind and the tide's power, it's too great for men to overcome, and perhaps it could be an allegory or a metaphor for the overwhelming violence of World War I battlefields. So if this is also about his son John, then perhaps this is about the way that the battlefields were just too terrifying, too violent. No one could possibly survive that, because this person whoever's replying to the speaker in the poem sounds very defeatist about the chance of anyone coming back in. So the next stanza. Has anyone else had word of him? Not this tide. For what is sunk will hardly swim, not with this wind blowing and this tide. So we continue this conversation that's being had between the speaker, who seems slightly desperate and is desperately trying to turn to any source of information. Then he gets these replies from someone, and the reply comes as a very short sentence. The short sentence of not this tide, it sounds matter of fact, which leaves very little room for doubt. Matter of fact is when someone is talking without too much emotion, just sensibly giving you the facts. And it's the second time this has been repeated, not this tide. The rhythm of for what is sunk and the alliteration they make it sound like some sort of truism. A truism is an old saying which leaves little room for doubt. A truism, I'll give you that word here, a truism. for what is sunk will hardly swim. Sort of alongside things like no pain, no gain, all of these little things that you might have heard, they sort of sound quite authoritative, partly because of the fact that they rhyme, partly because of the fact they have these sounds. There's something natural about it. So for what is sunk will hardly swim is again making it seem like this is a truism, that children die in war, that people that go into these arenas don't come back. And then look at the punctuation here. I've underlined them, you might not be able to see that, but the ends of each line have got full stops. This is what we call end stopping, and they add a sense of finality to these statements. They make it seem like there's very little wriggle room. You can't argue with these statements. We pause and we reflect on what is meant by not this tide each time, on the idea that maybe with this weather the sun just won't be coming back. So, moving on to the next stanza. Oh dear, what comfort can I find? None this tide, nor any tide, except he did not shame his kind, not even with that wind blowing and that tide. So the cry for help from the speaker is, we can imagine them desperately trying to find solace, which means comfort. We can picture them lurching around without finding any reassurance. We could also wonder if their lack of comfort is due to the sadness that they're feeling, or perhaps a sense of guilt. Think of the fact that Rudyard Kipling, he is, as you'll remember from the film, was very responsible for sending his son away to war. So perhaps he's looking around desperate to find some reassurance about his son, but also because he's starting to feel guilty. So then look at the words that are repeated in this stanza. The repetition of not and nor, and the word none, all of them similar end-sounding words. There's that sort of the sounds being alliterated, and they're all very negative, aren't they? None, nor, not. Going back throughout the poem, the responses to him every single time have been no's, negative words that suggest a really grim atmosphere, that there's not going to be any positive news. It creates a pessimistic expectation in the speaker after all the bad news that they've been getting. His own son's body wasn't actually found until the end of the war, as the battlefield was churned up by bombs over and over for years. This could perhaps be similar to someone who was lost at sea, which perhaps shows why this metaphor is so impactful for Rudyard Kipling, because many people's bodies weren't claimed until the fighting was able to stop, and until you find the body, you can't fully know what's going on. So perhaps that's why he's feeling this cluelessness that the speaker seems to be feeling. And then we get this word accept. Accept it's a conjunction, isn't it? I really don't like you, except when you give me food, right? This is a conjunction that changes the tone. We've had all of this pessimism up to here, and then we get a slight twist. It introduces a chink of light. There might yet be some hope. Perhaps this is because he was noble and brave until the end. He didn't shame his kind. If he'd shamed his kind, that might have been because he acted in a cowardly way. But he didn't shame his kind, he acted bravely. This is because the boy who's being celebrated in the poem didn't leave his station on the boat, which would have been terrifying. He didn't try and save himself, he tried to protect the boat. And so this could be similar to the son, John, who fought bravely. Now the bad weather and the natural forces, they're sort of painted as powerful enemies that the son refused to give in to, which makes their mention a little bit more triumphant, rather than being these sort of terrifying and unconquerable foes. They're terrifying, unconquerable foes that he nobly and bravely tried to tackle. Not with that wind blowing and that tide, the strong movements of the sea and the wind blowing. So final stanza. Then hold your head up all the more, this tide and every tide, because he was the son you bore and gave to that wind blowing and that tide. So the speaker, the person who's said these things before, asked the questions, they don't have an input here. Instead, they are told to be proud by this previously straightforward character who we've come to trust. Because of how no-nonsense they are, how straightforward this character is, we trust their opinion. There's no more not, no more nor. Now it is and every, which is much more optimistic. So all of this negativity from before is being replaced in this final stanza with something much more positive. Now that he is known to be a hero, the death of the son is suggested as a glorious, patriotic moment. This is the last message, which replaces the forlorn, grieving father of the beginning of the poem. So whereas we had all of this sadness, there's no news of my son, he'll never be coming back, instead it's replacing it with a more positive message. Well, he probably won't be coming back, almost certainly, but that's because he died bravely. That's because he did something amazing. However, the guilt seems to remain, as it was the father who gave the son to the wind and the tide. Remember what we were saying about him managing to convince the people, you saw it in the film, he convinced the people to accept his son into the army, even though he'd had that bad eye test. So what's he going to be thinking about that? He was the son that you bought and gave to that wind blowing and that tide. That seems like he had some role of responsibility in it. Possibly we could even blame him. So maybe there's some guilt remaining. Was it a glorious and patriotic gesture, or was it a foolish decision? Now, something to think about in this final stanza. Does this suggest then that Rudyard Kipling was guilty and felt a responsibility for the death of his son? Or was he convinced by the argument that he died doing something brave and so he should be proud of what he did? Well, it's interesting because it seems like this poem marks a shift of Rudyard Kipling from being someone who was very interested in patriotism, very interested in bravery and war, to someone who is maybe a little bit more ashamed of it, having seen the real effects. But there's something to remember here, and that's that not long after this poem was written, Rudyard Kipling was still appealing for recruits to join the war. So this doesn't seem to be someone who has decided that war itself is a terrible thing, a bit like some of the famous war poets that people think of when they think of World War I. He was still someone who was absolutely convinced that the Germans needed to be defeated. He was still someone who was terrified of what might happen if we didn't win the war. And so it didn't necessarily seem to mark a shift from being someone who was patriotic and wanted his son to go to war to then being someone who thought the war was terrible and no one should join. He still was convinced that the war was a good idea, which is perhaps why there's this message here about how brave the son had been going to that wind blowing and that tide. The Germans as some sort of awful storm that may well almost certainly kill you, but that you have to fight anyway, because otherwise it might destroy the rest of your people. And at the final note then, Rudyard Kipling's wife, he wrote a letter to her own mother saying, "There is nothing else to do. The world must be saved from the German. One can't let one's friends and neighbours' sons be killed in order to save us and our son." So this was sent just after the son had been sent off, in which they recognised that it was a terrible thing for him to have to do, but they also recognised that they couldn't be the only ones in their community to not send their sons. This was an obligation. Okay, so you might need to rewind, you might need to go back and pause, but there's lots in there to add extra notes to these boxes. You can underline words, highlight words if you want, bold words so that you notice which ones are important. These will all be really helpful when we come to write next week. Okay, so there's now some questions that shouldn't take too long. Why might Kipling have felt guilt for the death of his son? What evidence is there of Kipling's guilt in this poem? How is Kipling's personal grief and mourning conveyed? So, in what ways do we see someone looking sad, feeling a sense of mourning in the poem? What is the effect of the dialogue structure of the poem? So why do you think he's done it? As a speaker asking questions and someone replying? How does Kipling attempt to assuage the sadness felt by mothers? Assuage means to lessen, to make something better. The sadness felt by mothers and fathers. And finally, is there any sense of Kipling's conflict as he struggles to reconcile his patriotism with his grief and guilt? If you reconcile something, you're trying to find a balance between these two things. So he's trying to find a balance somewhere between his patriotism and his grief and guilt. Alright then, remember to ask me any questions if you get stuck. I can give you some help with the answers. Have a lovely day.